Good evening, everyone. Good evening. The lights are stunningly bright. So, good evening. I can't see you really at all. And if my eyes are shining through my glasses, my apologies. We're so really delighted to see all of you here this evening. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to give a little introduction to this evening's event to give some flavour as to why we're all here. And I've written a little piece, which I tend to do at moments like this, partly because I like to remember what I have to say. And it's called I Suggested to John Toomey Out in the Lobby. Anyway, we'll get on with this, and then we will continue our conversation with our friends here this evening. I suggested to John Toomey out in the lobby yesterday, when someone introduced us to each other, that I met him in 1991 or in 1992 or so, but having thought about it later, I don't really remember the first time I met him. What I think I recall is that I kind of met him and Sheila O'Donnell while as students we were taken to the recently refurbished Irish Film Institute and then the Irish Film Centre in Temple Bar. Paul Keogh took us. He told us on that day about Group 91, of which he too was a part. He was kind of smiling about the whole project, we remember. And I guess looking back, he must have been excited, knowing what lay ahead of him and all the architects of that group, about to build a lot of city, it seemed, all of a sudden. We students were oblivious then to its significance, with no idea over 34 years later we might still be talking about them all and that project, not to mind with almost 600 people here, you lovely people who've gathered in this room tonight. On the class visit to Temple Bar, we sat on the steel furniture in a room that just seemed inside out, a courtyard, but now a room with a glass roof, and still the most beautiful plan of the cleverest, clearest idea possibly ever made in Dublin City. I'm sure I was there close with Ruth O'Hurley, who is out there and still works alongside Valerie, and I'm sure we did not really understand that project fully, but I know we did feel something. I knew something new about me and the city and the subject I needed just 24 Leaving Cert points for, even if I could not quite understand it yet. And while it might be a stretch to say I have spent my last 30 years of life as an openly practicing architect, wandering around my kind of promiscuous practice, trying to figure out exactly what I did feel back then, it is certainly entirely true that I know the people on this stage for as long as I have known architecture. They are among the aggregate in my foundations, props to my walls, hinges that hang on the many doors that have opened, signposts to directions, windows to horizons. They have often set and lit the fire, and even from time to time, they have, if not literally, they have metaphorically made and often spilled the tea. And they know me enough to know that tonight is by no way an accident. It is a rather long and elaborate acknowledgement. I start personally because, well, architecture is personal. And if architecture is not made with the brain, as Peter Smithson has said, I would suggest that it does live in our bodies. We feel it, we carry it, it carries us. But as personal as it is, architecture is also everybody's business. By 1998, when the 1991 framework was almost complete, many have argued Group 91 had profoundly advanced the idea that architecture was everybody's business, and perhaps even more specifically tonight at least, that architecture had some business being part of the city and being right at the heart of our political and cultural capital. Sarah Lappin has noted in her assessment of Irish architecture the completion of the Temple Bar Framework project in 1998, which is shown here in its original competition format, meant that for the first time in Ireland, contemporary architecture was seen as useful. The entire Temple Bar Framework project had significant influence on the field of architecture in Ireland. Its commissioning model and the opportunity provided to a relatively young group of architects with little comparable urban design experience remains valued today. Over 30 years later, for architects at least, the Temple Bar Framework remains cited as a successful model and example of brave public commissioning, one that ought to be repeated in some manner. It is cited as being, by Andrew Clancy, highly innovative, with quality being assured by using a design contest to find the architects and nimble approaches being taken to planning and implementation. In reality, the commissioning process has been revealed to be more complex and ad hoc, with the architects only part of a more complex network of individuals and institutions who work locally and politically, some for decades, to develop that part of the city. The area itself has since been beset with controversy in terms of how, for some, the once cultural quarter ambitions of the framework have been deprioritised in a drive to instead champion the area as an economically successful tourist attraction. Nevertheless, the Temple Bar project remains within the field of architecture in Ireland very influential, and one of the reasons why we are talking about it here tonight. By the time of its completion in 1998, in architectural terms, the Temple Bar Framework project contained so many award-winning buildings that one assessor suggested that a single award should just be given to Temple Bar to get it over and done with. The urban regeneration model was hailed internationally as a model that other cities, commissioners and architects might follow, and it was also noted for what the project seemed to be saying about Dublin as a modern, forward-looking European city. David Mackay, part of the team that worked on another celebrated urban project, that of Barcelona, wrote of Temple Bar that the real function of the city depends on its diversity of people, ideas and aspirations for which its urban design must allow, going on to suggest that the diversity he found in Temple Bar post-framework completion began with Group 91. He suggested that the collective practice, by its very formation and workings, implied a discussion of ideas and conflicting solutions which gave life to the project, just like the city itself. The development company established to deliver the Temple Bar project, Temple Bar Properties, quite unusually for a project commissioned by competition with so many architects already involved, elected to award additional building commissions to those who had not won the competition but had been shortlisted, thus expanding the influence of this project beyond Group 91 and into other architects' offices, including to Blockman Marr, practices and into an evolving ever-cultural field. While then working as a loose collective, the architects of Group 91 at that time were already exerting considerable influence on the practice, profession and the wider field of architecture in Ireland. Indeed, the group has since gone on to attain significant cultural capital within the field in Ireland and elsewhere. Grafton architects who created their Free Space Biennale in 2018 were Pritzker laureates in 2020. O'Donnell and Toomey were awarded the RBA Gold Medal in 2015. Shane O'Toole became one of Ireland's most celebrated architecture critics and an advocate for Irish architecture in international events, publications and award schemes around the world. McCullum Mulvin, who have worked internationally, including building universities' buildings in the Punjab in India. Shay Cleary is quietly driving new innovation and thinking today into international acclaim on the most vital building blocks of any society, that of housing. And Magarini Ainey, in my view, perhaps even before the city was ready for it, have pushed our understanding and ambition for civic and public space and infrastructure here in the city, along the river and in Smithfield. Furthermore, individually, the architects of Group 91 occupied important positions of influence in specific parts of the field of architecture, including leading positions within education, writing, criticism, award assessment, and later many participated or acted as commissioners to international exhibitions of architecture, all the time producing award-winning significant buildings. These are busy people. The architects and their associated offices became significant employers of graduates and younger architects, very many of us in this room included. And very many of us and others went on to find their own architectural offices, many of whom were to become influential within the field of architecture nationally and internationally. By the end of this project, Irish architects had themselves moved into a new era of confidence and embraced the work that came their way from 1998 onwards as a result of our now legendary economic boom. As Sarah Lappin concludes in her survey of Irish architecture, the acceptance, even demand for contemporary architecture since 1991 owes much to the Temple Bar competition and its skilled winners. So our business here together tonight, all of us, is to unpack a little of this legendary history of Group 91, these skilled winners, this gang, as David Mackay called them, who campaigned and worked for a more open and plural city, their first action being to become plural themselves, to do so. We wish even more specifically to probe the creative imaginations that gave rise to the work made then in order to consider together what we do now. I am delighted to be joined with my esteemed colleague, Christelle Harouk, Editor-in-Chief of Arc Daily, who joins us for the summit and who will also be here tomorrow. And we together wish for all of us to leave here tonight with some sense, if not quite conclusions, some sense of more optimistic and real possibilities of what we might do next, here in our city of Dublin or there in your city back home. The world of reality has its limits, but the world of imagination is boundless. Tonight, we hope you will roam freely in the city in which we can all belong, and of which, in this room, we can surely now together dream. Thank you. So this is the awkward segue from one place to the other. Hello. Thank you. I should say on the outset, we're delighted all of you are here and you're representing your practices. And we also invited Derek Tynan, who said yes, but he had to be in another continent, and Paul Keogh, who also couldn't make it. So we were hoping to get the band back together, but they send their love and they were very thrilled to be invited. To get things going, and when Christelle and I are going to move between a series of questions, but what I've done is I've been a bit cheeky and I asked my friends here on the stage to send me an image, or an image of my maybe choosing, to kind of get the conversation going a little bit, both to reflect and project, to think about what happened maybe back then on a personal level and on a professional level, and also maybe to kind of bring it up to a little bit of contemporary life. So John, you're up first. This is in complete random order, actually, and my notes don't even match the way the slides have gone. One of the things I mentioned is that so many of you were making other work. By that I mean you were not only starting to build and think about Group 91 and start to make buildings, but you were also kind of constructing culture, I think. It was part of the mission, I think. Certainly it seems to be that way. And what I love about this drawing that you made of your assembled kind of plans of all your buildings, it somehow evokes that for me, that somehow work is built on work. And you were all very busy making other things besides the Group 91 project. Do you want to say a little bit about what the culture of architecture was like back then? Because you're a part of that and also influenced by that.
Yeah. Well, even before the Group 91 Temple Bar, Sheila and I were stuck into Temple Bar because we did the Irish Film Centre. It's like a little pilot project for what became the argument for Temple Bar, maybe. But I think this question, and all of us would have this in common, the relationship between teaching, reading, researching, and practicing. That architecture goes through you rather than comes from you, I think that's very important to me, this feeling of trying to address in your practice all aspects of what you understand architecture to be. I like that what you said, architecture is everybody's business. But this drawing was just one Christmas when I had no work left to do, and I also was annoyed because all our buildings are so damn small. So I thought if I put them all together, it would look like it could make up a town of itself. Okay. And it was very good for my mental health at that time. And also it was a lot of fun, and I should do it again. And some of those things, when they introduced themselves to each other, it spoke back to each other instead of things having to be the same, repeated. There's a relationship. There's probably a relationship between all the things you ever do. It's like writing one long book or singing one long song. And at that particular moment, I think, weren't we all of a mind?
But that had come about through the paper projects we had been doing for 10 years before Group 91. We had gathered together informally on occasions to make a project, for example, for an ideal street, where the plot of 6 or 8 meters width might be taken, and could you design a contemporary house?
That's in that photograph, the legendary photograph of you, the models in front.
Yeah, and there was in an earlier one that Michael de Courcy organised that was held in the Municipal Gallery. And it was very important that exhibition was in the Municipal Gallery because we wanted to show architecture the way art was shown. We wanted it to reach the same audience. We didn't want it to be, in a school of architecture, which is, architecture wasn't exhibited publicly before that. Yeah. But then there were projects Neil and Valerie did for In Dublin magazine, again using a popular platform to propose proposals for the repair of Bachelor's Walk in particular, which needed this is where urban dentistry first appeared in our projects. For the IFSC, before anybody had an idea that there would be an IFSC developed, the North and South Docks. So for the Pillar project, for a replacement for Nelson's Pillar, in 1988 for the Dublin Millennium, we exhibited that in the GPO. We got it on the RTE Late programme. So we were always trying to communicate these ideas. And when 1991 was coming up, Shelley McNamara was the person who provoked the first discussion and said, should we do something for 1991? And the first thing everybody said was, we've been doing paper projects for 10 years and it's got us nowhere. It has resulted in no work. It has resulted in no change of policy. And if we're going to do something together again, this would have to be a built exhibition. We would have to build the thing and let people walk through it. And the idea was to build that street, which Yvonne worked with the head of the planning committee in Dublin City Council to find a site that Dublin City Council would put up at risk. We brought Joan O'Connor in to project manage us. We went for full planning permission, got tenders on the scheme. Bottom fell out of the industry at the time, but the idea was we would build a museum of 6 houses and fill it with art.
Making a modern street.
Making a modern street. Yeah. So that was the one limit that was put on anything we would do in 1991 was it had to be real.
Well, can I, baby?
No, can I just
Yeah,
say,
of course.
When Shane says, that nothing happened as a result, I think because the theme here is also that people go away with the sense of optimism. If we can just describe what it was like in the 1980s here in Dublin, car parks all over Temple Bar, nothing seemed to be moving. There was very little work. But what was really interesting was a real deep belief in the fact that architecture matters and doing exhibitions. And also because we have our eminent chairwoman here, that the media connects and changes people's attitudes. So the whole thing was about changing attitudes. And as young architects with no work, it was really cheeky of us, I suppose, to say, well, give us a site and we'll do something, and there'll be samples of reality. But I think it was a belief that we have to not speak to architects only, that the public is the recipient of architecture, and we have to do things to try and communicate. So that black and white photograph with all those models, that led to the Temple Bar project because we had kind of had muscle to kind of do that exhibition. Then when this competition came for an international one, the fact that we were all very small practices, we had between kind of 4 and maybe 8 people, or none, as the case may be. But it was getting together. And there's a lovely term in Irish, in Gaelic, called a mehel, which is that each family on a farm, let's say, you didn't have all the machinery or all the human energy, but when it came to certain, you put together, you work together. And I think in this time, in terms of the way that we look at the world and you see destruction, you see also that when people work together, that architecture is an incredibly optimistic profession. Yeah. And that for us, we were young, we had absolutely nothing. We lived, the really secret is keep your VAT separate from your cash intakes, keep your overheads really very low, and then you can work and do things. And I think the amazing thing about the Temple Bar project was that I'm a great believer in one thing leads to another. Yeah. It's like strata of the way stone is formed geologically. You do something with integrity, you do another thing, you meet another colleague, and people are building up. So it was youth, it was enthusiasm, it
was also, I think, impatience and a sense of irritation that many of us had been abroad in European cities, and there was the idea that things seemed to be possible on mainland Europe, and we were this island off the edge. And hello, why the hell wasn't it possible here? So there's a certain impatience about the greyness of things, the negativity of things. And I think that fired part of the idea and to somehow act. And I think the making of the physical model of making a modern street, and it was a big kind of physical model, and the opening of it to the public meant they could see something kind of physical that they could recognize as something they might understand. So I think the making and doing is really, really important, and then you can communicate with others.
But actually getting the exhibition opened by Mary Robinson, who was President of Ireland, gave it a stamp of approval as if this is something that the nation needs to take seriously, and that government at that level is not doing.
But, I mean, as is the way with all of these things, literally all the questions I had have just been answered. But because you're so good. But I had a question for you, Shay. I'm curious as to how you got involved in this.
I mightn't answer it.
Yeah, my protest. But how did you get involved? Because I think Yvonne's point about the kind of the idea, or everyone has mentioned about this paper project and self-initiated work within the architecture field. Of course, that's not old and that's not new. That's actually always been the case. I mean, it happens today, and it even happens in a time of plenty when there's lots of building to do because there's always other things to be done, and not everybody has access to work. But I'm curious about your moment of engagement in starting with this Group 91 as well.
Well, I mean, in terms of the actual group, I was invited by somebody, and I can't remember who it was. I'm just looking around. Maybe they're missing. But, I was invited to join the group, and I'd been in practice with Yvonne and Shelley anyway, and in Grafton Architects. And so, we all knew each other very well from teaching and all of that. So there was a kind of community that I think was quite apparent, that we were all really interested in the city. We were and are all interested in what is the added value in any project, and we are all interested in the public realm, and that in every project, no matter how small or how big, can one give something extra back to the context and to the city.
Yeah,
and we do it instinctively.
Yeah.
I think we do it instinctively,
Yeah.
That's just the way we work, and that kind of binds us all together. I think it still does, and even though we're working at different scales and all of that. But I mean, that primary interest in saying, what do you give back through the material that you're given to the city,
Yep.
So I'm glad you put up that image. This is a lovely building I did recently.
I love that space.
So
it's so generous.
I mean, I won't dwell on this, but I mean, the brief here was to do a really large office building. And then through NAMA, with receivers involved, and we were commissioned in 2015, and we just said, okay, we have to make this really big office building, 20,000 square meters.
Yeah.
And what else can that building do besides just being a big office building and a really nice workplace? So we made a tall element that marked a point square in the city. We made a linear building, it's 120 meters long, because it's kind of the edge between the traditional city and the docks. And then, because we weren't dealing with normal developers who would tell you to get lost, we lifted the whole building up 7 meters and made this kind of gathering place because of the adjacency of the Three Arena, which kind of has a capacity of 15,000 people.
Yep.
So in the evening, it kind of belongs to the people in the city.
Yep.
And in a way, during the day, it belongs to the people who work on it, and it's kind of overlap. So,
but I've never seen that photograph, Shay, and I think it's a good photograph. It just looks to me like Lino Bombardi
yeah.
in Sao Paulo. Just that whole thing of the generosity, the space underneath, and the lifted thing.
Sure. And then we also made this big this external structure, which cost a fortune, which we wouldn't be able, which I mean, we ruined it for every other architect ever who would say to somebody, I want to do an external structure. They just go, please. But it was because it wasn't a normal developer. A normal developer would have said, shops on the at ground level, and please don't do anything complex with the facade. So we were lucky, and the luck thing comes back, I think, to the whole project in Temple Bar as well. I mean, that project wouldn't have happened except that Charles Haughey took it on as being, yes, I'm interested in this, and I want my name associated with this.
Yeah.
And he was Prime Minister, so, that was really important. And then he appointed the most able, clever, wonderful, sympathetic man in Paddy Tehan, who was Secretary General of the T-shirts Department. And Paddy believed in the project, he believed in us, he loved us all, he loved all the ideas. He was the most wily, clever civil servant you could ever imagine meeting.
Yeah.
And worked through all these things about CPOs and buying a bit of land and doing this, and believed in the ideas that we were putting forward to him. So it got carried through. It wouldn't have happened if Haughey and Paddy Tehan hadn't been involved, I think.
Yeah, no.
No matter how good the
Had
ideas
all
were.
of the land gathered together.
Yeah.
They needed the CIE land. They also needed the fact that Máire Geoghegan Quinn, who was at a meeting of ministers in Europe, when I think it was Luxembourg, pulled out and decided they wouldn't, after all, stand as City of Culture in 1991. And there was a gap. And Máire Geoghegan Quinn put her hand up and said, we'll do it. And it was as simple as that. She put a call through to Charlie Haughey, and she said, we'll do it. And that was like something like 9 months before the city became European City of Culture, but it was driven by Haughey, and he saw it as his lasting legacy. He was very friendly with Mitterrand in France. This was the year of the Grand Projet in Paris, and he saw this as a series of little things that together would be a Grand Projet that would leave a popular legacy that would match his financial legacy when he was creating the IFSC.
But
and it would make him a man of the people.
I think there's an important thing for people to remember as well. CIE, who are the big company for transport, wanted to build a huge transport hub in the middle of the city. And so they were buying up land, and it was like freezing an area. And in the meantime, people were given short leases, and artists were weaving their way in. So there were cracks in the system, let's say, that this fantastic area, shabby kind of area, was available for people. And then as people went in, they became, if you like, the citizens of the place. So they became a power. In a sense, they were, things, the bad thing was that the big bus station was going to come and obliterate, but attitudes were changing in Europe. They were changing that existing fabric has a value. Character, which was is still very hard to actually define, has a value. Old bricks and shabbiness has memory or has a language that speaks to people. So the people then that had the short leases, the artist studios, were making this kind of left bank kind of organically, and they had a stake in it then. So it's people. Don't forget that, going back to the thing of what Siobhan is saying, that it's also that people were kind of, hold on a minute, why the hell would this gorgeous rooflit studio be torn down? Why would things be... And also I often use the analogy, in dentistry, up until a certain time, if your teeth weren't great, they just pulled them all out and gave you, that was grand. And then they realized that the structure of the human body needs to keep itself kind of maintained as best as possible. The same thing was happening in urban planning, that the teeth of the city were not going to all be pulled down, but it was somebody sitting in a garret with a very low rent. Like the main problems with contemporary cities is that all the spaces that were the odd spaces, peculiar bed sits and things that we all lived in at one stage, they're all being obliterated out. You need cracks in the system. You need low rents. You need people in cities. In the end, cities are places for people to enjoy each other's company.
On that matter, I put this image up because I really love it. It's Smithfield Square, which if you haven't been there, the braziers lit in this photograph that Siobhan shared with me just behind the forecourts there. And I'm interested in what happened in your conversation and in your experience, not just you, but obviously maybe because you've made that such a significant public space in the city. How the Group 91 project, and you already mentioned it, this sort of referencing of the European tradition of the city and the public space and the public square, and Yvonne references in terms of spaces being for people. But that trajectory in your work and thinking around how you might conceive of what was quite a radical and still is a radical space in our city, I think.
Well, I think both Michael McGarry and I went to work with Klaus in Germany in his own practice first, and then he was director of the new buildings area in the IBA, and he asked Michael and I to come with him to Berlin to work on the framework planning of the new buildings area. And the city was a divided city, so we lived in and worked in West Berlin. But it was an amazing experience in so many ways. But speaking for myself, I would say Michael would say the same. The thing that struck most and that remained so significant to us was an appreciation of the importance in this bombed out place of public space and the public realm and the idea of society, and that society needs rooms of different scales to operate in. And that is public space, whether it's streets or squares, or whether it's bridges or boardwalks, or whatever the mechanisms are that within the public imagination and also within within what the public feel they have the right to go to and be in and negotiate. So, I mean, the idea of public space was the key takeaway for me, certainly, in relation to the whole experience in Berlin and the importance of public space as an expression of society. I always remember coming back, we came back in the mid-'80s, and things were grey on all kinds of levels. And then the troubles in the north are always there, and they are a significant part of the story of this island. And our neighbouring island and its Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher at the time, I always remember in 1987 her saying that thing of there being no such thing as society. And it struck me that for a leader to say such a thing was such it was such a wrong somehow to us believing in ourselves as human beings and our capacity to negotiate life in a collective. And the city was the best representation, in a sense, of what that is as a constructed entity. So public space for us just became a very key part of what we were interested in at the time. In terms of the Group 91 stuff, the bridge, the infamous bridge, became our obsession, and the way through the block in what was called Puddle Gate to get into Meeting House Square. So it was the irrigation north-south that was a key aspect, and it was one that fascinated us. It was probably doomed from the start because half the site wasn't within the what became the area of the both the competition and ultimately the work. Anyway, that's maybe another story. But you referenced this. This was another competition. It was 1987, if I remember correctly. There was there was a city manager at that time and a city architect. And the HARP project was part of City Council. It was still called Dublin Corporation, but became known as City Council, Dublin City Council. And part of their mechanisms for driving change in the city. And Jim Barrett and John Fitzgerald, and also Dick Gleeson as planner, they were quite a triumvirate, in a sense, and wishing to find a means to help, if you like, the development of the city at the time. HARP was a mechanism, and within that there was a competition for this site in Smithfield. And it was an international competition, and our practice won this. And for us, it was an amazing space, amazing scale, about 360 metres long, 40 wide, kind of a slope of about a story of a drop to the city. But it was a place you wouldn't find. There was no marker for this at all on the skyline of the city. And even though it was this very historic and significant space. So we decided we wanted to do as little as possible to somehow to establish the scale of the space. Hence this line of 12 masts. So it was, for us, it was about a point, which was an existing chimney, a distillery chimney, a brick chimney, a line, which was this line of 12 masts that were 9 stories high, and a curve, which was about the surface of the space, which was a cobbled space, but it was impossible to walk on or push a buggy on. So to make it accessible, universally accessible, was part of the competition brief, and for us was something incredibly important. So the curve was a big, slow curve in relation to the relaying of cobble and the inclusion of slabs, new stone slabs. So the reason for the braziers, and the braziers, it was such a challenge to do this. The reason was, and you picked the slide, you asked for this slide, was about marking this space on the skyline at night so that people might find it and know it was there. The braziers, we only intended that they'd be lit really at holiday times, but or over Christmas or special days. But Jim Barrett liked them so much that they were on the city map. They were lit every single weekend in the beginning.
Good man, Jim.
They were so.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Anyway, that's the story of that.
Thank you. Yvonne, you mentioned earlier, and this brings Valerie and her work with Neil McCullough in, to this memory that's held in buildings that you're reusing, and you obviously have a long lineage and trajectory of relationship to the city in terms of reuse and adaptation.
That's right, and in fact, a bit like John and Sheila, we were also working in Temple Bar before Group 91 because we were working in Temple Bar galleries, where the artists had taken over a kind of a shirt factory, and they were working there very successfully. But it was very cold. There was no fire cert. It was a bit of a fire trap actually, and they used to move the exhibition space around depending on what was the best place, the best fit for whatever the particular show was. So you'd come upon places down a corridor with lots of canvases stacked against the walls and into a room where everybody would have painted the floor white. And it was a magnificent place. And with Rory O'Keefe then we worked on that building and then worked on others. But that whole thing about developing the idea of space that you could add to and hopefully keep people in the city, because in the end, as Yvonne was saying, the city is nothing if there's nobody in it. And we all grew up in the city like that. We walked across car parks where there had been buildings. And Neil's last book was all about that idea of walking in one place, through a staircase, down another stairs, out through a hall door in another part of the city. Just because you could do it. You could actually wander through the kind of the skeleton of the city in the 1980s. So that was something that really did influence a lot, the work that we were doing. And we spent some time in Rome, which meant we spent a year just drawing one ruin sitting on another. And that sense of layering and palimpsest was very, very strong for us. So this is a project which I like very much, because it's really about reusing a bit of space that nobody knew was there. So it's a bit like the inverse of Smithfield, in that it was finding a site for the Dublin Dental Hospital, who were thinking of moving out of the city, but they said we just need to have space to find a library somewhere. And we spent some time looking at it, and we thought on the back slopes of these 5 protected structures, maybe we could build them a library.
They look like very comfy chairs for a dentist.
They are, but they are the meeting chairs of the library. And you can put 2 of them together and you create a space where people can talk. But they're kind of like a gas leak.
Yeah, we'll come back to some of those things. Shane, I think it was you who told me about the drawings. This references your work, but this is not necessarily for you to speak about it. But was it you who told me about the drawings that were made for the Temple Bar, for the competition framework, and why they were made the way they were?
Yeah.
We saw earlier.
Well, first thing was we had to get into the competition, and we worked hard to get into the competition because the odds were stacked against us. The Institute favoured large established practices for it. We had no track record, we had no economic size, we weren't trusted. And so as it happened, I was involved in the Institute at that time. I think I was vice president. But I suggested to the Institute that there should be a foreign juror, that this competition deserved a foreign juror, and the principle was accepted, and they said, well, who? And probably quite irregularly now, I mean, I suggested Alvaro Siza, and they contacted Siza, and Siza was unavailable. But he said, oh, the person you need is Oriol Bohigas. And so they phoned Oriol Bohigas, and Bohigas said, unfortunately, I can't do it, but my partner is ideally suited for this, David Mackey. Because he has Irish connections. And although he had been living in Barcelona and a partner in MBM since 1958, he had family connections in Ireland, but he also had a very specific connection to do with the Easter Rising. that at the end of the Easter Rising, during the Easter Rising at Boland's Mills, which was under the command of Eamon de Valera, he had been taken prisoner. He was in the British Army, and he'd been taken prisoner and was held as a prisoner in Boland's Mills. And when the order for the ceasefire and to lay down weapons came, de Valera was unsure as to how genuine this offer was and whether there might be a potshot of him as he came out. And so he came out with David Mackey's grandfather, and they came out hand in hand out of Boland's Mills. So Mackey was on the jury, and we did one thing with the drawings. We decided that we didn't want our scheme to be easily identified. At that stage, I think everyone in the group drew in rotring a la Jim Sterling. The drawings were they were new and original in Ireland at the time, but they were very identifiable. And so the first decision was made. I think the people who were in charge of putting together the drawing packages were Sheila O'Donnell and Rachel Chidlow. And the decision was made very early on that there would be no black and white drawings. Everything would be in colour. And it was probably the first time, I think, that colour appeared in any of the drawings that most of the practices did. And so they were rendered in colour. And then, Mirabile Dictu, we won the competition. And David Mackey asked, after the jury had written its report, and the result was going to be announced the next morning, but he asked, could he write an addendum to the jury's report? And he wrote this wonderful one-page text, A Letter from Europe, in which he said that the historic relevance of the winning of the Temple Bar competition, was that the public authority had returned to its primary mission to regulate and develop the social space of the public space of the city. Now, that's a message that still needs to be heard today, loud and clear. And he said, and it does this by defining the public spaces, by which I mean the streets and squares, their sequences and proportions. And after that, the market can follow with the framework that has been established by the public authorities. And I think if there was one thing that came out of Temple Bar as a kind of a lasting message, it's actually that kind of one-sentence text from David Mackey, which is every bit as relevant today as it was 30 years ago.
Thanks. And finally, we have to complete this exercise. Yeah.
Because the thing that was, I suppose, unique and interesting, I suppose, about what we were all trying to do was to keep absolutely everything that was there, and to turn the car parks where sites had been assembled together into our public spaces, and to say that these would be the things. And then we cut the curved street through, and Neil McCullough wanted to call it Dissenter Lane, because you could think about that in many ways, Dissenter Lane, which is as good as others earlier. But that was because that was such a long block, and we felt it just needed to be irrigated a little bit. So there was a little bit of adjustment to make it curved, simply because it was the way that you could pick up the gaps between the buildings.
Just a swerve. Swerve.
Yeah.
Finally, maybe just for this part, I'm conscious I've left Christelle hanging there. Just on this idea of influence, Yvonne, of importing and exporting. I mean, you've already touched on it, all of you, a relationship to working abroad or importing ideas and also exporting them. Can you just maybe give us another context as well of what was influencing your thinking at that time beyond what you were finding?
You mean in Temple Bar?
Yeah.
Or
in Temple Bar, but you know that this kind of, as an island nation, we've always had this import-export in terms of our influence in travel and where culture has come from architecturally to influence our thinking and actions here.
I think just following on what's been said about the plan from John's drawing and what Shane is saying and moving in terms of the east-west movement. I actually did my thesis in UCD on the site where we did Temple Bar Square. You know, it was just with pen, rotary pen, black and white, as you say. But the influences, what was amazing was that there was enough open space to not need to knock things down. And so we weren't going to knock things down anyway. It wasn't that kind of thing. But it was just little moves that made a huge difference. I think that's the thing that we learned. I mean, the interesting thing here, I suppose, the image on the screen is when Shelley McNamara and I were asked to be directors of the 2018 Venice Biennale. We had to have a theme, And we chose a free space, not architecture as object, but architecture as enclosure, the outer skin of us as human beings. And then translating it into different languages was also very interesting. How does each culture take free space? And going back to Shay's point about, what's the ingredient that you, like architecture, I often describe a thing that architecture is like somebody going over Niagara Falls on a rope with a pole. And it can either be commerce or art, and you spend your time trying to balance those two forces, the commerce or the art, and you've got to find balance, and down below is the Niagara Falls. So there's kind of, life is precarious. But like Siobhan was saying, or what you were saying, Shay, about raising up the building and finding something, that really what we were trying to do in Temple Bar, as 8 individual kind of thinking firms, how do we find some sort of cohesion that the things in the city, even the shabby sheds, some people would walk down there then and go, oh, you must be joking, we'll clean it up and we'll have a brand new something or other. And the competitions that we had entered, going back to Shay's point, were normally won by the mega firms from some other country probably or whatever, who just said, right, tabula rasa, you need a new thing, we'll do it, we'll just get rid of all that old fuddy-duddy history. And I think for us, it was finding the little cracks, making public space, making that east-west connection. There were other ideas that we had about bringing Foster Place, which is a very beautiful place around the side of our first Parliament building. It's now a bank, but it's a very beautiful south-facing space. And we were thinking maybe if you had a little route down there, a bit like you were saying about the curved street. So we were trying to be investigative about space. It wasn't the shiny kind of, clean it up. But I also think what was wonderful about the competition is that the clients then, the idea was to give all of the small practices a project, that it wasn't just one thing.
That was fought for.
Oh, we fought for that.
Like we were, like...
Shay and I went into a room together.
Like when we won the competition,
Yeah.
when we won the competition, there was a kind of, thanks guys,
Yeah.
young architects,
Right.
thank you very much. We have a master plan now. Now we're going to go and give it the work to all the big offices. And we just weren't going to stand for that. And John and myself and Derek were designated by the group to negotiate with the government. And now thankfully we had Paddy Tehan, who was the government representative, who was very sympathetic, kind of going along with us. But we had numerous meetings. It was interesting. We used to drive up to government buildings and go in, and we were ushered in, 3 of us, and meet all these people. And we were saying, we have this idea about making these spaces, making this east-west route. But we want to actually make the spaces as architects.
Talking about colour drawings, we had a black and white drawing
Yeah.
of our interventions on the public spaces. Yeah. And we rolled it out in front of Paddy Tehan.
Yeah.
And he said, which one of these bits do you want, guys?
We said all of them.
And we said, I remember with Shay saying, we don't want much, we just want all the public buildings and all the public spaces.
Yeah.
And Paddy Tehan said, is that what you want? And
Yeah.
it made his life much simpler because...
It did, yeah.
And actually that was our commission. Amazing.
That was our commission, and because we were...
We should have asked for more.
No, but I mean, yeah, we should. We should have done the bus interchange as well underground. But we
should have asked for more.
We were we were hell bent on actually making these things happen in reality, and making the architecture. And like a lot of the buildings that we did, including say Art House, which I did. I mean, they're kind of thin buildings because we were trying to make public space, and we were trying to protect other buildings. And the space left over was quite confined and narrow, and it's the same with the photographic gallery. These are kind of thin buildings that actually make the public face of a space. But they're actually, quite complicated because there wasn't much room to make the building. But that was kind of interesting as well, Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to say one thing about collaboration because I think it applies to architects trying to get bigger work. I mean, collaboration is a wonderful thing, and it's a lovely feeling to, rather than being siloed in your own kind of clever ideas, that you're actually sharing all your knowledge. which is a brilliant thing, you know. And, you know, you're talking to somebody in friendship and saying, that's a great way to do that, but actually this is actually an even better way to do it, which you wouldn't normally share, you know. And I found that amazing. I also found the kind of passing the baton part of this amazing, which was, I didn't work on the curved street in the competition. It was Valerie and Neil. So, and then, you know, I worked up at the West End and I made a kind of a diagonal route, which was kind of a different version of Cowes Lane heading up to Christchurch. So I was working up there. But in the end, when we kind of divided up the work, I ended up on the curved street doing Art House. And Siobhan and Michael were doing the west part of the West End, a lot of the West End. And there was all this kind of exchange of, you didn't need to start the idea to be the person who carried it through. It is really interesting.
But not until tonight, at least in my life, not until tonight has Yvonne revealed that that was her thesis site.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're not too pleased.
You've been keeping that from us.
Christelle, gonna hand over to my friend.
Hi, everyone. So you answered a lot of my questions already, but putting things a bit more into present context, I would say, if Temple Bar was being designed today, what global urban planning principles should be applied, in your opinion? So technically, if we say that, what would a modern day version of Group 91 prioritize in shaping the corridor? Yvonne.
I think we realize what's fantastic with 30-something years in hindsight and being able to see the consequences of all the energy that all those people and all those people in government, you know, gave us the opportunity, is that that architecture is much more than bricks and mortar, and that the housing. Reading this document again, it's great to find the kind of innocence of the document again, but we were also talking about 5,000 citizens, you know, that it was going to be a place where people would live in the city, and that has achieved a certain amount. It's not 5,000. I think it might be 2.5 or 2,000. I'm not sure. So one of the things that when we think about Temple Bar is that now it's become a tourist mecca, and that people really enjoy it and they have fun, but that then the bars, which were, you know, snugs and small spaces, have become mega bars. And also it's hard. There's a well-known journalist who lived in the city for many years, who has written extensively about the noise level and the, you know, when you have a 24-hour, that there's also an issue of how compatible normal life is. But we need legislation, and also many years before, I can't remember the exact date, but Shelley was terrific at finding kind of old shells around in Temple Bar, and we went to in fact the place where that journalist did live years later, that there was a warehouse, and we went to the banks trying to get seed funding to just make the building safe and basically serviced, so that people then could get areas and make studios and do it cheaply themselves. But the banks would not release the funding for that. And I think looking back on it and looking at it now, and all the, like Derek Tynan's gorgeous housing that you kind of go in and is still very, very beautiful place, that trying to insert more residential brings another kind of scale to and vibrancy to a city. I think the legal structure of how people rent space in this country is phenomenal. Somebody was telling me, we were just talking about it, that it takes 40 years to build up your right to a place. I think something that I don't know in detail. So I think the law is involved. I think policy is involved. I think that looking back, I think we didn't have any of those things to deal with. Certain things worked really well. We had benches in the first time we did Temple Bar Square, but then they were taking off because people were sitting on them. And we were attracting riffraff. And you realize that benches are one of the most democratic things that you can give a city, when that you can sit quietly someplace. So wonderful that it still exists. The character is more or less there, and it's also about sustainability. It was actually very ahead of its time in terms of now you think twice before you knock parts of city.
Shane.
Well,
Same question.
my takes, if you like, wouldn't be all positive at all. I think that tourism has been a disaster. Over-tourism has been a disaster for Temple Bar. And there are other cities like Venice and Barcelona who have been the canaries in the coal mine on this thing. It's not as if it's new. You know, in their places, whole communities are being upset. First of all, Venice, the communities have been driven out to Mestre and to the mainland because their flats can be bought and their houses can be bought for selling knickknacks to tourists. In Barcelona,
Airbnb has taken
Airbnb and the inner city has been destroyed. Simple things that you wouldn't expect that become really disasters when you get this kind of mix is the surface of the pavement. Wheelie luggage on cobbles at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning makes it impossible for the local residents who have to get up at 6 to sleep properly through the night. I think the surface, Shane de Blockham, I think, used to always say that the most important thing about a city or a town or a building, I think it was him, was a good carpet. You know, the first thing a place needs, because that's what pedestrians experience. When you're walking around, first of all, it's actually what are you walking on? You know, you think of motorways, they're idealized carpets made for cars. You look at our footpaths in the centre of Dublin. I mean, I've moved out of Dublin for the last 10 years, and every time I come back, I get more and more depressed by the urban carpet, by the narrowness of the footpaths in major areas compared to the areas given over to road traffic, by the condition of maintenance of the paths, where it's okay to come along and dig up 18th century stone and just throw a bucket of tarmacadam back in its place when you're finished doing whatever you had to do. The signposts, the bins, all of this is pointing towards a wide shared Irish failing in all aspects of what we do, which is maintenance. The Irish mindset believes that you build something new, problem solved, and we can walk away.
Maintenance free.
Whereas maintenance free, which is utter nonsense. The completion of the project is only the first stage of now engaging in a new way of life. So it requires really serious management that has a vision attached to it. That requires political change. And we have a very, very centralised central government in Ireland and a very weak local government. So we have no mayors. Even if we had mayors, they'd be political statues. Do you know? They wouldn't have actual power. Like last week, I was in Mechelen in Belgium, small town, about a half an hour from Brussels, less. It used to be the capital of Belgium once upon a time in the Middle Ages, is its claim to fame. But it is a UNESCO World Heritage City. And the last time I had been there was about 4 or 5 years ago, and it had problems with mixing traffic and pedestrians. New mayor came in, just said, we're going to stop all the cars coming into the city centre and all the vans and everything like that into the Altstadt. We'll provide ways for people who live here to get in with their car and get out. Everyone was cycling. Grannies were cycling. Granddads were going around with front-loader bicycles doing their shopping. Building materials were being delivered by bike. The surface of the entire city, streets and pavements, had been altered. And our guide, I had a guide who was bringing me around, and she said to me, I said, well, what's been the political fallout from this? Because obviously a lot of people have been upset. And she said, well, in the last elections in October, the mayor's percentage went down 3%. Because as many people see the benefits as see the downsides. So those are things that can't be solved by architecture. They can't be solved by planning. They can't be solved by local government. And until the central government releases the power and stops using junior politicians in competition with local councillors, we won't be able to break out of this wretched circle. We'll get hotspots from time to time where we get a gap, like with Paddy Tian or Charlie Haughey on a particular occasion. But you wouldn't bet your house on finding another one of them in the next 30 years.
Building on that idea, John, who gets to shape the narrative around the city's transformation? Architects, policymakers, the media, or the people who live there?
Well, if we're talking about what happened in 1991, I do think it was an incredible convergence. Maybe this relates to what Shane was just concluding. First of all, there was an arts organisation kind of culture bubbling up out of the short-term tenancies in Temple Bar. Then there was a kind of a new interest in the fabric of the city in a younger generation. Then it just happened that in the city council there were young planning officers who were interested in something new or something different. And then there was this freak thing that that we managed to win the project when we might not have been the expected candidates. I mean, to us it was a requirement that we would win. Like, we entered it to win it or get out of here, But still, the fact that it was picked for being mixed up rather than singular was unique. And when it came to be implemented by the Department of the Taoiseach, led by Paddy Tian, he knew. There was a young woman who had been our client at the film centre, but who was involved in kind of community activism. When I say young now, we thought we were young, but we were in our mid-30s or something. But Laura McGahey was 26, 26, and she was put in charge of maybe she was 27, but she was put in charge of the whole project. And the other person who was put in charge of it was the guy who had been gradually acquiring all the properties for CIE. There he is, who swapped hats. He just swapped hats. Right. Because he knew every little detail of the area. Now, if you take all those convergences with the idea of a patrician, overseer, it doesn't happen every day. And it's completely wrong to think that it's an architect-led project. It's one of those moments that
ley lines.
One of those moments where things come together. Yeah. So it's amazing hearing Emma talking about that legendary picture, but the real legend, I think, is this fact of convergence at a particular moment. The trigger of European city of culture is probably important because we were pitching a European line, That's what we were all interested in, Barcelona. But it just worked at that moment, I think.
It had the word cultural in it, which meant they didn't have to develop another big cultural project for European City of Culture. They already had the main component.
So if you're thinking your question was what can you draw from that? And the problem is you need a lot of luck,
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add one other thing to that, which I think was crucial in this, and it's very interesting when you say there were young planners who were really interested in something. There was a lack of fear.
Yes.
Because actually things couldn't get any worse.
Yeah.
So really, it
point.
was a really important moment where you could really say, people could say, well, we may as well do this because actually, that bit of the city is a bit of a mess. So let's do something with it and see where it goes. And that's not evident now. Everybody is trapped in a worry about what they do, about what they allow. If you go and talk to a planner or a conservation officer or whatever, they are worried. And that's the first thing you have to do, is to try and help them understand this is not irreversible. This is not something that is so dramatic that it's going to kill people. And, I think that's a really important thing that we all spend our time doing, is reassuring people that what we're doing is not mad. And that's, it really does have to be done. It's not a simple thing. And I would love to say that it would be great if people who are in positions of power now were able to act without feeling there was somebody going to come behind them and say, you shouldn't have done that. And that would be great.
But what is amazing is that when you think of the state of the finances of the country back then and the state of this country now in terms of the monies available for infrastructure, for all the things, it's like as if conferences like this really have to raise the spirit that things need to be done and they can be done, and this is the legacy that is important for society. It's not enough to say there's a problem here, there's a problem there. The wonderful thing was that the Temple Bar project cut through, as you're saying, there are ley lines, John, that kind of things happen, and people have to come out of the woodwork now. Things have to be done now. We have the money, we have the energy, we have the talent to do it not just as a national level, but there are people, we have huge homeless problem. We have problems, but they can be solved. And that I think there are young architects, there are mature architects, there's a lot, it's not just architects, it's a whole societal push that needs to be done. We just have to do it. It's not like, oh, you can't because of this, or there's a delay. We just have to do it.
So what's missing?
But you need people. You need people in authority who have imagination. You know, like one person we mentioned in passing earlier was Jim Barrett. You know, when he was city architect, I mean, Jim wanted to do great things for the city, and he commissioned architects to do projects. He combined in a really clever way the private sector and the state in developing derelict sites, you know, like the thing I did in Dawson Street, or the Irish Times office that was done. You know, he had an imagination about what should happen to the city. And you need more people who are in positions of authority who have a vision, you know, and want to get things done. And I mean, and at the moment, I think there aren't many of those people. I may be wrong, but I mean, they're not coming out. They're not appearing in public and saying, you know, this has to change. You know, I mean, it's hard to find people like that.
But there is also, I think, something about the maturity of the state that maybe is part of the question, and maybe it's also part of the answer. Like, for example, we have an amazing main street in Dublin, O'Connell Street. I think it's an amazing piece of public space, but there's nobody living on it. I mean, I find that's just a shocking idea. I think there was an article, was it last year in the Irish Times, that was one person living on it. And I think actually, Emmett, you were involved in a programme, a primetime programme or something, you know, which actually, that's right, that reminds
today.
me.
He's in the Irish Times today.
Oh, fair enough.
I'm a fan of O'Connell Street.
Yeah, about O'Connell Street, you know. And on the one hand, we're in a situation where, you know, Dublin it's an historic city. It has old fabric in it, which is the theatre within which society happens, and that's important. But there's nobody living in this big street. And I remember in Temple Bar, I think one of our taglines was, you know, a neighbourhood for whatever, 3,000 or 5,000 people. I think it was 3,000.
Because at the time, in the 12 hectares, there was a resident population of 250 people.
Yeah.
That's all. There was no community to work with.
But
no big community to work with.
I think that, for example, we have building regulations in Ireland, you know, and if you build according to the build, and there are the documents with the worked out solutions for different aspects of building, but it's for new building. But say our existing buildings, you know, there isn't a neat set of documents, you know, that will guide you to be able to do this. So what happens then is, you know, people don't kind of touch them, and certainly and then we have, of course, self-certification, you know, the idea that an architect might come up with a solution, and then they have to certify this as complying with building regulations. But the truth of it is, unless you use these documents, you then would have to go and test and find, is this solution actually compliant with all of the many myriad requirements and they're all important. They're fire, they're structure, they're Part M, about universal. They're all very important. I'm not decrying them in any shape or form, but there isn't a match between that and the idea that we value our built fabric, our old built fabric, but we want people to live in it. Now, this happens in other cities and in other European cities. I think of Amsterdam, it's been spoken about, and it has issues of tourism and all that. But I would visit the city kind of regularly because it's it's very easy to get to, and you can get to other places on trains very easily But it always amazes me every time you come in from the airport on the 397 bus or whatever, and by the time you come to the Olympic Stadium, from there on into Leidisplein, there are streets upon streets upon streets of residential streets where people are living lives just near the centre of the city. There are families, there are playgrounds, there are little shops, there are just people living in this city, and it's an absolute hive. But you do not get that sense at all, or at least in my experience, you do not get that sense at all in the centre of Dublin, certainly not people living lives in the old fabric. So, for example...
The reasons are to do with things like insurance,
yes,
fire,
all of those
cost,
things. All of those things,
and
Valerie.
risk. And the big thing
Absolutely.
about risk is a huge thing.
It is.
And I know I know because I've been doing some work on towns recently, and people would be sick hearing about me talking about towns. But there's something like 90 policies for towns, and I saw Nikki earlier. She will tell you the number. And if we need 90 policies, it has to suggest that something isn't working. So there's problems with enforcement, but the main thing is that people are not talking to each other. And to get the planning officer, the conservation officer, all these people into a room together, the fire people, and to make a solution there and then that everybody is happy with is really difficult because nobody will challenge health and safety.
Exactly, I
And
agree with you.
I think we are over-regulated, and many people will say that it's wrong to say that. I don't think it is. I think we're over-regulated because, again, the thing about judgment and fear has been taken out of what we do on a daily basis. And it's very easy to solve, but it needs vision and it needs people to be willing to do it. And they
It
are
also
willing,
needs,
but it
it
really
also
needs a
needs,
push.
I think, an honest discussion. For
Yes.
example, the idea that, health and safety, and they're critical things. Don't get me wrong, I'm not playing fast and loose with any of this. But the idea that you can be absolutely assured that, there is no danger, for example, in living in an old building. I mean, maybe there are judgments about, what is the nature of the kind of living space and who might live in it. For example, I visited a friend in Prague about 2 weeks ago. He's almost 80. He lives 10 minutes from the Old Town Square in an old 18th century building. It's just got a lift. It's on the half landing, and he goes up the stairs. He still is able to go up the stairs. My point is that it's a judgment about what somebody is actually happy to live in. And the idea that it's not possible, nothing's possible because of fire, it means we have an empty city kind of from the ground, a first floor up. We have an amazing main street and there's nobody living on it. I mean, there's something
But
wrong.
it's true of Irish towns as well.
It is. Valerie is doing fantastic
Yes.
work, with
I think
the
that it's
IIF.
probably true that the volume of built space in the country is sufficient, but it's just not accessed.
Exactly, it's
There are
not
90
used.
housing
Can I
units
just
now.
ask,
Anyway,
maybe ask
yeah.
to frame the question, because I accept the legislation has to change, but nothing changes political action more than public desire, actually. We vote people into politics all the time, the same people, for the last 100 years. So, how do we, and how do you, change culture? Because if people decide they want to live in the city, it will happen. So, something has to flip. We can't wait. So
It needs to be made easy.
it needs to be made easier,
Yes.
for sure, accept it. But also people need to want to. And is it fair to say that that desire is not in us to live in the city? Or is it just that it's not easy enough? Or what is going on?
I think-
And how would we shift this?
I think
Because
part of it is you have to get people
we can't wait.
interested in the idea of living in apartments, for instance, and not just in houses, I think that's an important aspect.
Yeah.
Like there are so many Georgian buildings around, and if you could streamline the regulations like Siobhan you're talking about and Valerie, I mean, you could have 3 or 4 dwellings in a Georgian house if you could rationalise the fire requirements and fire separation and all of that, you know, those houses, 3,000 square feet or whatever, they could have 3 or 4 or whatever dwellings in them. But people have to be prepared to live in buildings that are not just your individual house with front and back garden. You know? And I mean, that's the way you live in the city.
Well, I might just add, I mean, because we're working outside of Ireland as well as inside of Ireland, but I think one of the real problems here in relation to this discussion of neighbourhood and the values of density is that here in Ireland, the housing authorities tend to think in terms of unit number, unit cost and unit. They think unit is the living unit, you know. But the question of the journey home or the space in between or the access to creche or the access to gardens or the access to school, this just doesn't come up in the discussion of housing. So in fact, it is probably ruled out in the discussion of housing because so focused are they on the provision of numbers of units. So a cafe on the ground floor or a creche on the garden, roof garden, takes up space that could otherwise be a living unit. And I've been working on a tower building in London. The towers are not the exemplary, but I was just so interested that the discussion among all the planners and all the agencies and the community involvement was, how does it hit the ground? How do I get from my flat down to the park? Where do I park my bicycle? Where do the kids play safely? Like all these things are in the brief, including the physical things of how the building hits the ground or how the building is lifted off the ground or how the building hits the sky. There's a much, outside this culture, there's a much wider sense of the relationship between accommodation and human life, you know. So if you're asking me, I think we just need to put the word neighbourhood or some word like that much more into the public discussion and not only talk about numbers, you know.
Yeah.
And I think not only talk about culture, which at one level is an alienating word.
Yeah.
It suggests an exclusive elite. You want to bring everyone with you, or as many people with you on this journey, in this argument, this battle as you can.
I don't see
neighbourhood's good.
I don't see Shay so often, but I didn't see you at the Nick Cave concert that I was at. But when I came out of the Nick Cave concert, the undercroft of your building was full of people, you know, singing the songs. And I said, I know the guy who designed this, you know.
Yeah.
I used to work with him.
I thought you veered off into something else.
But I think that creates a space that doesn't have any other purpose except generosity, you know. And I think that's really,
It's remarkable.
that's outside our conversation at the moment in terms of housing. I mean, housing is the big issue here, but the trouble about, if you call it housing, you suddenly reduce it to
Atoms.
yes, and I think that's like the legislation covers that. It's the real question is about life in the city.
It is. That's what it's about.
How attractive is life in the city, basically? Because you can have grassroots movement that are actually, like obviously we're all agreeing on the question of the legislation, on policies, but also there is some sort of grassroots movement, a bottom-up approach that needs to also start in that sense, where basically we can go back to Group 91 and how, let's say, personal. I don't want to say, help me out. I don't want to say personal ideas, but there is some sort of vision that was very collective of all of you to give back to the city, to do something better. And it wasn't a question of a brief. It wasn't the housing brief of 1, 2, 3. Yeah. It was exactly like your project, looking at creating a public space where a public space is not needed, or probably an accessible space.
Well, maybe what's interesting about the discussion this evening is I have the great privilege of being able to walk from home, which is a kind of 1850s little square that has a common, just grass and trees. I walk to the city, I go in the back gate of Trinity. It's a complex, it's a city garden, it has housing, it has major rooms, it has a religious space, it has research, it has libraries, and the form you move out the gate and you come into College Green. It's just an amazing physical. If I don't walk through Trinity and I go another street, and it's kind of a slightly grumpier day, because the architecture brings you as a kind of a participant in your life. And the point really, your question about housing, maybe the thing is that it is called housing and not about spatial making. Like, let's take Trinity just as an example. That has housing and whatever mixed together. Maybe the thing should be not the various departments of government and not the various, residential, whatever. That it really has to have a new word, which is about how do we make series of enclosures that are public, and the thing feeds into it. I mean, there are examples where kind of surfaces are made and then things clip on the back. I mean, Merrion Square took something like 70 or 90 years to build, but the central idea of a continuous wall housing done speculatively to a common space. Okay, it was a Georgian time and a different time. But maybe the push would be to not fracture it into housing and separate specialists, that it's about not specialists, it's spatial, that urban planning is really about that the common container is built first and then things are fed into it in terms of strategy, but a spatial strategy. Maybe that's what's happening, where you've got housing, you've got industry, and it keeps being separated, that it's not the linking spatial idea. Architecture is the public space is choreography. It's like a different discipline.
Neighborhood, what John was
Well, I think we
talking
need
about.
we just need a different discussion of density, because we shouldn't, people are afraid that density means that they just get stacked on top of each other relentlessly. And there should be some kind of champion of density that brings with it all the things that we get from, the advantages we get from density, the shared things that we can get. Convenience to cinemas, schools, creches, gardens, we just need to describe it differently, I think. I was thinking about the 600 people here and thinking about imagine if they all lived on O'Connell Street, wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, wouldn't it just?
And in fact, there's only one of them.
Yeah.
There's one person here who lives on O'Connell Street.
Actually, the AIF has booked you all into empty rooms on O'Connell Street.
We bought O'Connell.
That would be an experiment. That would be an
Yeah,
experiment.
we just took it over.
But John's suggestion about Yvonne's too, I think, about needing new words for ideas that don't yet exist or haven't yet crystallized is an important one. And it literally comes back to this whole discussion. Temple Bar is a relatively new construct. In 1980, if you said to anybody in Dublin, where's Temple Bar? What's Temple Bar? No idea. It wasn't a part of the city. Like if you said where's Stephen's Green, they'd know where Stephen's Green was. But if you said Temple Bar, no. If you said Smithfield, yeah, sure, they'd know where Smithfield was. In 1985, 10 years before we finished our work, on Tashka, which is a National Trust for Heritage, conducted a very, very significant and cheap survey. It was of the surface, the ground surface of what we now call Temple Bar. Well, from Crow Street to maybe went as far as Parliament Street or Eustace Street. And it was just a series of drawings of every cobble, kind of all measured out, the whole thing, where they were stone blocks, where there were cobbles, where there was a watering basin that a horse used to drink out of, where there were coal irons and everything like that. And for that report, they had to come up with a name. And they called it the Temple Bar Study. Temple Bar was just literally 100 metres long. It was the frontage of your square, Yvonne. But it didn't go into Fleet Street and it didn't go into Essex Street. And it was just a tiny street 100 metres long in the city. But then it was they gave it the name, the Temple Bar area. And after that, it became a rallying point. It was then that the artists and the recording studios and everyone said, yeah, we're all part of Temple Bar. It was then when the Crisis Conference, Dublin Crisis Conference, which was organised by Dean Victor Griffin and Frank MacDonald and a number of others, took place in 1986, the Temple Bar area was something you could point to, and it was something you could point to Charlie Hockett to, and everybody said, oh yeah, it wasn't quite 12 hectares in those days, but it was about 8 hectares, but it was an area of the city. As everyone said, wow, this is an area. And now they started looking at it as an area.
Yeah.
And none of that would have happened, I think, without the invention of the name, the Temple Bar District.
I think this idea for us, or for me anyway, that this idea of names and things that we have to give some character in order for them to exist is really really potent way to maybe start bringing this to a little bit of a conclusion as we head past 8:30. I mean, in our work, we've been talking to a not-for-profit in Limerick and a number of other not-for-profits who are trying to make a building for themselves and their colleagues in Limerick, and nobody will give it to them even though they need it because nobody knows what it is. They can't name it. It doesn't exist. It has to be imagined. It has to be invented. Mm-hmm. And so many typologies that we need just simply don't exist. They just don't, because we don't know how really we live, I think, a little bit. We're not really mapping it or tracking it or really deeply understanding why nobody's living on a common street except that it's bad or something. So we need to know more things. But we are coming to the end of our evening. But I would like maybe to ask that cliche question, which is, you've all been involved in education. You all know the level of talent and skill, and I've seen some of those people are here in the room tonight thinking about how they act in the world. And one of the things I really appreciate what you said and gives certainly many of us here faith for doing events like this is we may not solve anything tonight, but we're getting fit. We're practicing for when the time comes, for when all the things do align and we can make a big difference in the city. But what would you say to the group out there, like Shane's letter to a young architect, who wants to get together and do things? Where should they start? How should they go? Should they just get busy? Or what would you ask them to take away with them tonight? And actually not just the architects, all citizens, everybody who has a voice has been pointed out in making change. Give them some encouragement.
I'm looking at a programme for tomorrow here, and it says, the city reused, unlocking potential in the city that is already built. Now, I think that's a magic thought, that there's stuff already exists, but its potential is not harnessed for the city and the citizenry. So I think that young people, and that generally speaking, we need to respect what is already built. It has value, it has potential, How do we use it better? And that's part of tomorrow. So I think that's a very good thought in my mind, that people think in relation to what exists and the potential that's there to find, to use what exists. Sure. And redescribe it, reinvent it, remake it, but use it.
Thanks, Shay.
I'd say to architects, collaborate. Young architects, collaborate. You're much stronger. Together. You can be seen as a bigger element on the horizon rather than just being on your own, and work together. And I think that's very liberating. And share your ideas, and also. Try and work on projects where you can put ideas forward to people in authority. Find somebody in Dublin City Council or whoever, a planner or whatever, and just say, look, we're looking at an area here and there could be a few things done. There are 4 practices here. You've been thinking about it because we live in the area or whatever. Could we put this forward somewhere? You need to find a receptive voice, if you like, and you need to then propose ideas that might be the germ of something that will happen. But I think collaboration for young architects is essential.
And take care of the receptive people.
To survive, to survive. And it's really, the whole industry is so complicated in terms of EU procurement and all of that. It's just nuts. It's impossible to get a project. That really eloquent letter that Marcus and Will had in the Irish Times after they won the gold medal was about that very thing, which is to say, you work together, you're stronger,
Yeah.
And you'll produce better work.
Thanks, Shay. Anybody else want to answer that? Or
I'd like to really name that at a government level, we have a country that can do things now, and that it has to be done, both from below and above. That architecture, that cities matter. People live in cities, their daily lives are there. To have a tree, to be able to open a window, to have a terrace that's not just Like it's fantastic building in France, they want you to have a terrace that you're able to have, 6 or 8 of your friends on it and have a nice evening meal together. That there's a cultural phenomenon, if we're going to live more densely, that the ceilings are tall ceilings, not the minimum, that the terraces are big enough to have, your pet dog out there or have your 8 friends. That it's a quality of life. I think the thing to share with other kind of generations is that it's a value. How do you have values that are decent human values that building can encourage? And also, the huge numbers, our population is rising, and people from other cultures are coming to live on this island in terms of global warming and the change of climate right across the earth. That we are able to welcome people and to welcome their particular cultures, that buildings aren't just stuffed, people aren't just stuffed into containers that doesn't express their kind of cultural maybe difference, but elegance of floor to ceiling, enough space, not just the minimum, but also variety. There's a brilliant project in Finland where we had it as part of an exhibition in the Biennale, where it was about having a 5-meter high floor to ceiling that allowed you to have one space which was a volume, or over time that you could have more bedrooms built into it, so that you can have a space that goes right through your lifespan. That it isn't that you live here because you're single, or you live here because you have 2 kids, or you live here because it isn't zoning. We need, if you like, to build in sustainability in the volumes that are made. That life is for living, not always changing, that homes are not commodities. When you make a home, you can stay there and plant a tree and watch that tree grow, and the building can be stuffed.
Yeah.
There's a lovely Arab saying that a house of love is never too small. That you can have a kind of a range of life, that you can make a container that's adaptable. So adaptability, I think, and flexibility within the new things. Yes, there's the containers that exist, but also in terms of new, that it isn't either a house with a garden or you're stuffed into an apartment. That isn't the spectrum of choice. That it's about imagining a flexible future that anchors you onto this precious planet.
Thanks, Yvonne.
I think, I'm sorry, Valerie. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing that we need everybody to be so aware of is the material quality that's here in the city that we're ignoring at the moment. And I think it's going back to the idea of values and so on. I think the great thing about what we were doing when we were doing all those counter projects before we got near Temple Bar was that we were actually working on things. And we were actually testing out things where we didn't really know how things worked, but that's how we got to know how things worked. And if groups of architects are working to try and make a project to do something, like to see a derelict building and to come up with, you have to find out who owns it, how do you refurbish it, all of these things. So there's a whole process of understanding how to do things that I think you will get by working at it and by taking projects yourselves that maybe seem improbable, but just do them and let them become contributors of things that you'd like to happen. And I don't mean that in any naive, unrealistic sense. I mean tooth and nail with real determination.
Well, there you are. See, I thought I interrupted you, but you were just going to say what I was saying, which is, I think you're not going to do what we did, but I think this question that Valerie raises about action, about doing something, collaboratively maybe, but doing some, and I was trying to think about this, and I think Ireland has maybe the best government policy on architecture that exists in the world. But I now that I'm legendary, I can say that nobody in my working life from any authority has ever mentioned how that government policy in architecture is relevant to what we're doing right here, So it isn't about writing more policies, I think. No. It's, if you're actually asking us what should a young person do, I think what a young person should do, and indeed collaboratively do, is just look for the gap, Look at the system and find a way through it. And So architects propose things, and architects are inclined towards action. So you just have to find the lever that allows your action to be, get some resonance somewhere. And you've just got to get through.
You don't get another go, Shay.
Okay.
No.
Creativity. Be more creative, right?
Be more creative, but
outsmart the system.
find the way to do it that arises now.
Yeah, just outsmart the system.
Yeah.
There are policies
Outsmart
everywhere,
the system.
but it's the way.
Creative may not be like architectural design or urban
Yeah.
design.
Oh.
Yeah.
There's lots of ways I think that we need to be creative. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is that this is an international conference of the open house groups and colleagues from all over Europe. And you're sharing today and yesterday and tomorrow information with each other about your own experiences and what you can learn from each other and so on. I think that the Institute has, I've asked them many times, John has too, Marcus and did as well after that, Will did after winning the gold medal, that we have to look at changing the procurement rules for younger architects, the barrier in at the entry level to small public work. And I may be wrong, but I don't believe the Institute has grappled with this in the correct way. The Irish government has chosen, for whatever reason, perhaps just bureaucratic simplicity, to interpret the procurement regulations and requirements from the EU in a very particular and narrow way. It's not universally applied or interpreted in the same way across Europe. And if your institution won't do it, or your institute won't do it for you, it might be a service to your generation if 6 or 10 of you, particularly maybe with international contacts or international experience, actually sat down together and said, how is this done in Germany? How is it done in the Länder in the north and the Länder in the south? Is there a variation in that? How is it done in Spain? How is it done in Finland? In other words, and flow chart how public work is given to young architects, because the system is not the only one you have lived under, and you need to change it, and you may have to change it for yourselves. So I think that might be the most important thing for you. But I think for the authorities, for public authorities, I would go back to David Mackey's advice of 30 years ago of setting an example in the public realm that the private sector will then follow. The only part of the city that the authorities own entirely are the streets and squares and parks. And if Dublin's streets and squares and parks were of an international standard, and they are not, they are rubbish at the moment, if they were brought up to that standard in small increments, like maybe the way Oriol Bohigas did in Barcelona, in little pockets, time by time, small projects that could be given to small firms of architects to spend a lot of time on, put more resources in than a big office would do, that they could set a standard in urban public space by doing that. And there are already, you can see signs of it where there is a good city manager. Kilkenny is a great example. If you go down there and compare the streets of Kilkenny or Waterford, where there's a city architect, if you go down there and see the streets of the Viking Triangle, it can be done. And I would love it to be done for Dublin.
I'd like to thank you all very sincerely for coming this evening and for being part of our summit. It's been a rare privilege and a rare honour to have you all here, and we're sorry we missed some of our friends who couldn't join us, and to the others who are here from part of your practices, also you're very welcome, and thank you. I'd like to thank Christelle for coming to join us and being part of the summit, and of course all of you who've been here this evening patiently listening, thank you very much for coming. So to Shay Cleary, no, we're not going to do questions. Shay Cleary, Siobhan Yaney, Yvonne Farrell, Valerie Mulvin, Shane O'Toole and John Toomey, thank you so much for your time. It was great to have you.